For centuries, soldiers trusted one thing: a stone wall. Thicker walls meant safety. This was the unchanging logic of war. Then, in 1688, Vauban redefined warfare at Phillipsburg. He turned fortresses from defense into deadly traps. Before 1688, stone was considered an absolute answer, not a risk or inquiry. For any 17th century commander, a fortress such as Phillipsburg provided the definitive. This resolved the conflict between attacking forces and ensuring survival. The Rhine River naturally curved around its western side, acting as a defensive moat. The robust angular walls were constructed based on principal conflicts. Commanders would position their troops behind the parapets, arm their weapons, and anticipate battle. The stone separating them from the adversary offered the greatest assurance in wartime. Phillipsburg was located at a crucial Rhine crossing, Exiv's eastern influence, while the Holy Roman Empire aimed to reclaim it. When Louis initiated the 9 Years' War in 1688, Phillipsburg became the initial objective. Between 30 and 40,000 French soldiers advanced, bringing 52 heavy force, a military contingent capable of victory through sheer numerical advantage. However, Louis did not dispatch a general to command the siege. Instead, he sent Vauban. Sébastien le Prestre de Vauban was then 54 years old, having surgeon comprehends bone, recognizing not merely their appearance, but their inherent vulnerabilities. He had dedicated decades to designing them. I believe history often misinterprets him quite significantly. Vauban is frequently acknowledged as a master builder, the individual who encircled France with an impregnable chain of fortifications. He erected every wall with full awareness of its inherent flaws. This demonstrates a distinct type of intellect altogether. The artillery principles he encountered at Phillipsburg were centuries old and mostly static. Cannons typically fired in high arcs, dropping projectiles into fortresses from above, or aimed directly and forcefully, attempting to penetrate stone with sheer impact. Both traditional methods proved slow, costly, and easily anticipated. Defenders understood the likely trajectories. They would excavate deeper, hunker down, and await the barrage's conclusion. However, this is the true nature of ricochet fire. It involved no novel weapon, no increased charge, nor a heavier projectile. Rather, this diminished velocity led to a flatter, lower trajectory for the ball, exiting the cannon's muzzle at such a slight angle it scarcely ascended. When this slow, low-flying projectile hit the ground before a defensive position, it did not embed itself as a typical shot would. Instead, a single projectile, fired once, created a continuous path of devastation that traversed through a defensive line. Conversely, ricochet fire was engineered to travel along a line. This crucial difference changed everything. The Phillipsburg defenders had arranged themselves precisely. They remained low, utilizing the wall. Soldiers were strategically placed behind parapets at specific angles, thereby reducing their vulnerability to direct enemy fire. However, this entire tactical approach presupposed the threat would arrive from above or directly. It also assumed the projectile would cease movement upon impact with a solid object. When Vauban's cannons commenced firing, that appeared to originate from the very ground. The cannonball did not signal its approach with the typical arcing descent. Instead, it flew low and continued its trajectory. A soldier attempting to evade the initial path by moving left discovered the ball was still advancing towards him. The defensive parapet he sought against a projectile moving parallel to its surface. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect wasn't the casualties, but the perplexing silence. No insight in Vauban's understanding here, and I will state it clearly. He utilized the very element soldiers trusted most, The wall, the trench, the fortress failed to shield them. Instead, it channeled the projectile directly through their ranks. Military historians refer to this as the enfilade effect, a flanking fire that moves parallel to a... No one before Vauban had devised a consistent mechanical method to deploy it effectively against fortified emplacements using conventional siege artillery. He provided enfilade fire with its practical application. Distances, trajectories, and the distinct sounds of approaching projectiles. Ricochet fire rendered these interpretations useless. The rules they had ingrained, which allowed them to maintain steady hands and clear minds amidst combat, no longer aligned with their immediate surroundings. This disparity between what was anticipated and the actual reality became a distinct weapon, one that Vauban employed with the same calculated. Phillipsburg ultimately surrendered on October 30th, 1688, following merely 6 weeks of siege. By then, the innovative technique had unequivocally. Phillipsburg was not the conclusion of the experiment, but rather its concrete proof of concept. 9 years subsequently, during the Siege of Ath in 1697, Vauban once more employed ricochet fire. However, this occasion was not due to standardized. The precise angles were predetermined. What began as a subtle revelation at Phillipsburg transformed into a replicable system, implemented from one siege to the next. This approach spread. Throughout the 18th century, ricochet fire was subtly integrated into the siege practices of every major European army. It was neither overtly publicized nor publicly celebrated, simply assimilated, mirroring how potent knowledge often propagates silently, shared among engineers who grasped the significance of their discovery. Consider the profound implications. Every major fortified European position, or that low ground offered security, had been subtly invalidated. The physical stone endured, but the foundational logic upon which it was constructed had been utterly undermined. Is it possible that this represents a more renders existing architectural designs obsolete? Take, for example, the 1914 Siege of Liège. German artillery deployed weapons the Belgians had never anticipated. Regarding artillery capabilities at specific ranges and angles, the underlying principle mirrored that which Vauban had utilized 226 years. Disrupt that assumption, and the stone structures inevitably yield. What Vauban grasped, and what I believe most preceding commanders never fully comprehended, is that a fortress is not merely constructed of stone. It is built. Logic that initially instilled a sense of security in that wall. This represents an entirely different magnitude of destruction altogether. Solid cannon shot became outdated during the mid to late 19th century, with the advent of explosive shells replacing it. The concept that geometry can overcome architecture, that one doesn't shatter a defense by increased force, but rather by discovering the angles its builders overlooked. This idea remains potent in every arena of conflict involving structures and the individuals. Phillipsburg persists today in scattered remnants along the Rhine. The very walls that Vauban's artillery targeted in 1688 are largely absent now, having been dismantled. However, the strategic calculation that brought about their demise was meticulously recorded, duplicated, educated, and perpetuated. The fortress itself. The most lethal weapon at Phillipsburg was not the cannon itself, but the specific angle it fired from and the intellect that discovered it. If these types of